Obviously, you really can't do much with AI unless you have GPUs, and NVIDIA basically makes the best GPUs to do AI things. Today, we got some really interesting details and basically rumors about what the 5090 might look like. And this comes after Jensen Huang's Computex 2024 speech, where he talked a lot about GPUs and a lot about the future of AI at NVIDIA. And even though he teased what actually is coming after Blackwell with this parabolic performance curve that NVIDIA is promising they're going to deliver on, there was actually zero mention of a 5090, and he actually walked around stage holding a 4090, which is sort of funny given the amount of hype around the RTX 50 series and how dated the RTX 4090 is in Q3 of 2024. So I want to unpack some of these new details, why I think these are probably a bit more accurate, and talk about when we might actually see an RTX 5090 and if it'll even be good for local AI. So welcome to AI Flux, let's get into it. This article is from videocards.com, and they're very clear that this comes from the notorious GPU leaker and or rumor mill creator, Kopite7Kimi. Now, obviously, we've gotten some details from this guy before, and the details have been kind of all over the place. We've gone back and forth from how much RAM it'll have. We've gone back and forth on how many slots it'll be. Initially, we thought this was going to be a massive 4-slot GPU using the biggest cooler NVIDIA had ever thought they could even engineer. And now it's gone back to being 2-slot. But we're not talking about form factor today. We're talking about some core silicon attributes that will actually have direct correlation to how good this GPU will be for AI. We're not really going to talk about gaming. We're not going to talk about bundles. We're just going to talk about, A, whether this is actually going to happen, how it is looking relative to the other lineup of 50 series GPUs, and where we're going forward. I do want to do a bit of a teaser for a video that I'm coming out with soon, which is basically covering what the most popular NVIDIA GPU for local AI actually is. Obviously, the 4090 is still pretty expensive, and I'm going to let you guys guess what that is. To be fair, Jensen Huang left a pretty big hint because he signed a number of these at Computex, and there was actually even like a special NVIDIA version of this, and Gigabyte made a version of this card called the AI Top. So I'll let you guys guess in the comments what you think that is. The question here is, will the 5090 look like the 4090, and what might the rollout look like? So what we know now is NVIDIA is planning to release these one at a time, and they're probably not going to start this release cycle with the 5090. And we know that all of the 50 series GPUs will have a pretty similar spec ramp to the 4000 series, but the 5090 will be within a class of its own. And this was something we weren't sure of. We weren't sure if the 5090 was going to be kind of limited relative to the other AI GPUs because NVIDIA wouldn't want this to eat into their market share there. And it looks like that they're selling the Blackwell H200 for so much money. At this point, one of them is around $250,000, that they're not really worried about that anymore. And it looks like, although the 5090 probably isn't going to be positioned as kind of a Titan-esque card, which is basically a pro workstation consumer card that's still technically sold as an RTX GPU, but obviously they intend for this to be kind of within a class of its own and probably have a better profit margin than the next equivalent of the RTX 6000, or more importantly, kind of the RTX 4500 and 5000, which were great GPUs, but frankly, most consumers would have very little reason to buy those because they're pretty useless for anything outside of workstation applications. So assuming there isn't a pop in the GPU bubble and that people still want to buy these GPUs for their own work, I think NVIDIA is making a really interesting case here. Now, what Kopite7Kimi is mentioning here is the specific differences between the rest of the spec, so the lower performance RTX 5000 series and the 5090, and basically guessing which of these is the 5090. What happened here is he basically claims that this is the spec sheet for the memory size and bandwidth of each of these new specs. The GB202 to 207, basically those are just binning specs for different classes of GPUs NVIDIA has. So the reason we have binning is when you make really complicated integrated circuits like this, they're never perfect. And the reason binning happens is obviously NVIDIA can't afford just to throw out everyone that isn't entirely perfect. And they've developed really complex ways to understand exactly where they're not perfect and then selectively disable those and then just sell those as GPUs that just have a few less tensor cores or a few less streaming cores. And this has been going on for multiple decades. That's why we see the spec going from GB202 all the way down to GB207. And ironically, GB202 is likely what the 5090 is because it has the most lanes and it has the fastest GDDR7 memory. And you'll notice that the width of the memory bus on what we think is the 5090 is twice as fast as the GB203, which is pretty cool. What's also interesting is when you compare to the RTX 4090, which is the AD102 spec, this is roughly a 33% increase in both memory bandwidth and performance. And what's important to note here is that when we're looking at GPUs for AI, memory bandwidth is massively important because all the information that you're actually acting on is in GPU memory, and how quickly you can push that in and out of the GPU is a big deal. So of course, the width of that bus matters, the amount of memory and the speed of that memory matters, and then obviously the GPU is the most important part. So the big takeaways here, especially since these are likely coming from some kind of engineering sample leak, is that these GPU dies are probably not going to be used in their full configurations for actual graphics cards. And again, this comes down to binning. So for example, even the current RTX 4090 uses the AD102 die, but not in its entirety. And even the A100s, which are based on entirely different larger dies, still don't do that. Because TSMC is incredibly good at fabricating these types of chips, but it's still really hard to do because you're fitting billions of really small, complex integrated circuits onto these chips, and it's just really hard to do. And what's interesting is when we look at how different GB202 and GB203 actually are. So in past GPUs, we haven't seen this much of a difference. And this is probably because GB202 is probably pretty similar to a workstation equivalent they have, just with less memory, just maybe with a slightly smaller memory bus or something lopped off that was a common problem. The reason that these specs change so commonly, and I interned at NVIDIA, so I know quite a bit about this, is because most of the final model specs result from downstream production issues of making these GPUs. So when they decide, oh, we'll have the RTX 6000 have this much memory, this much bus width, etc., the next lower spec is basically just whatever commonly failed in the spec above it, then turned into a product and nicely packaged. We're probably expecting maybe 32, but more likely still 24 gigs of GDDR7 in the 5090. It's really kind of hard to say based on the memory bus width. Below the 5090, the most we'll probably see is 16 gig, and I just wouldn't see NVIDIA to have a reason to give more memory to whatever the 5080 will be. I think the 5070 might kind of become a sweet spot again, especially with local AI being a big reason people are buying these GPUs. And in terms of gauging performance, this is really pretty hard. So the rough metric that we use is counting SMs, or streaming multiprocessors. So these aren't CUDA cores, these are kind of the bread and butter of computation in NVIDIA GPUs. And GB202 has a roughly 33% increase in SMs compared to AD102. And I think the rest of the roster for the 5000 series will probably have kind of just a piecemeal improvement in performance. Maybe some more wins in efficiency, but if we're looking at SMs, GB203, which is directly below the 5090 rumored GB202 GPU, only has a 5% improvement in SM counts over AD103, which is everything in the 4000 series. And following with what NVIDIA did with the 4000 series, when you step down to GB205, there's actually a 17% reduction in SMs compared to AD104, which some would argue is because games are getting much more efficient with how they use these GPUs. So NVIDIA kind of saves even more money and can sell even more GPUs as a result of this. And NVIDIA has been caught doing this before. But some, again, would argue that this is just because they're making so much money with their AI GPUs. So I thought this was kind of a cool update. It's cool to see the 5090 relative to the rest of the field that they're planning to release with the 5000 series. We're really hoping for 32 gigs of RAM. The other thing that would be interesting is, usually, and this, well, we'll probably have to wait for the release to see this, but it's always interesting to see which specs of NVIDIA GPU dies are actually capable of using larger memory modules and sort of overcoming some of their initial issues with bandwidth. There's some interesting tricks that can be done with certain GPUs. This is why we've seen 3060s with, in certain cases, more than 12 gigs of RAM, and it's why we've also seen instances like with the 2080 Ti, where you can actually nowadays buy modded versions of that GPU that actually have 22 gigs of RAM, which is pretty cool. And normally those wins come from the companies that make the memory actually deliberately producing memory specs for this. So I'm curious, are you waiting on the 5000 series to upgrade? Are you just going to buy an AMD GPU? I personally wouldn't advise that. Have you been waiting for the 5090, and are you hoping that we see that potentially before the end of 2025? Because right now that's what it looks like. And then we also have to hope that a certain large country doesn't absorb Taiwan back into them, because that would obviously make it a little bit harder for TSMC to make all these GPUs that are actually currently likely in production and being tested right now as we speak. So yeah, let me know in the comments below. As always, I hope you learned something. If you like this video, please like, subscribe, and share, and we'll see you in the next one.